Whispers of horror slithered through the silent halls of Kensington Palace. Queen Camilla had done the unthinkable. She had mutilated Princess Diana's legendary wedding gown, the ivory masterpiece that had captured the world's heart. Behind closed doors, staff murmured of envy turned vicious and a queen haunted by Diana's eternal shadow. Then Catherine arrived and froze. Shattered silk lay in heaps, pearls scattered like fallen stars. Her voice trembled. This was all we had left of her, her final gift. Collapsing over the ruined treasure, anguish and fury collided. The question now hung over the palace and the nation. Was this a desperate act of closure, or the first move in an explosive royal war? The dress that transformed history. The dawn of July 29, 1981, brought unprecedented excitement to London's ancient streets. Countless souls lined the pavements, many having slept under stars, desperate to witness a commoner's transformation into royalty. Cathedral bells harmonized with the crowd's anticipation, while television crews positioned themselves strategically, preparing to broadcast this historic moment globally. As Lady Diana Spencer's golden carriage approached St. Paul's Cathedral, thunderous cheers erupted from the masses. Yet the roar dissolved into stunned silence the moment she emerged. Every eye fixed upon her creation. It was the gown that would redefine royal fashion forever. Diana's wedding dress defied every expectation the world held, crafted from lustrous, ivory silk taffeta. It gleamed like captured moonlight in London's summer rays. The voluminous sleeves billowed with romantic grandeur, while precious antique lace whispered stories of centuries past. Delicate pearls adorned the neckline, each one catching sunbeams with every graceful movement. Then came the train, a breathtaking 25-foot cascade of pure silk that flowed like liquid starlight, extending down cathedral steps, tenderly supported by her attendants. Spectators gasped audibly. Many pressed trembling hands to their hearts. This wasn't merely a wedding gown, it was poetry transformed into fabric. The Emmanuel design duo had labored in absolute secrecy for countless months. Their vision was Diana, as a living fairy tale princess, and their achievement was flawless. Not one design sketch or fabric sample had escaped their guarded atelier. They understood the world held its breath, and they intended her revelation to be utterly unforgettable. That morning, as Diana ascended those sacred steps with humble grace beneath her flowing veil, the gown became her voice. It spoke of a young woman chosen for extraordinary destiny. Soft, yet commanding. Romantic, yet powerful. This was a dress that demanded reverence, that proclaimed, "Witness this moment of history." Across the globe, 750 million souls paused their lives to watch. Families crowded around flickering television screens. Neighbors gathered at shop windows displaying the ceremony. From remote African villages to bustling American cities, from quiet Asian towns to European capitals, humanity shared one unified vision. Diana, radiant in ivory silk, stepping toward her destiny. The dress captured hearts because it transcended fashion. It embodied hope. To millions, it represented pure innocence and limitless possibility. Others saw it as the dawn of a revolutionary royal era. It appeared lifted from storybook pages, an ordinary girl wedding her prince, entering a realm of castles and crowns. Every intricate detail carried profound meaning. The antique lace connected Diana to generations of royal brides before her. The British-sourced fabric honored tradition and national pride. Hidden within the dress lay a tiny golden horseshoe, secretly sewn for fortune's blessing. The designers had gifted her something private, a whispered prayer woven into silk. Yet for Diana, the gown meant more than spectacle or cameras. She had confessed her terror about the wedding day's magnitude, but wearing that creation, with its magnificent skirt and trailing splendor, she felt utterly transformed. It became her armor of confidence, wrapping her in royal courage made of silk and dreams. Standing beside Prince Charles at the altar, witnesses marveled at how the dress commanded the vast cathedral space. St. Paul's soared skyward with architectural majesty, yet the gown never appeared diminished. Instead, it expanded outward, claiming dominion over the sacred chamber, radiating Diana's spirit and declaring to every observer that she was destined for remembrance far beyond this single day. And remembered she became. Morning newspapers worldwide featured her image across front pages. Headlines proclaimed it the gown of the century. Fashion authorities celebrated its brilliance. Brides yearned to emulate its magic, and children everywhere sketched its flowing lines in their notebooks. Diana hadn't simply worn a wedding dress. She had revolutionized the very concept of bridal majesty. Decades later, people still speak of that dress with reverent awe. It rests in exhibitions, protected like a sacred relic. To Diana's sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, it represents far more than historical artifact. It remains a living memory of their mother, a tangible piece of her soul that endures beyond time, a sacred relic of love and loss. Following Diana's devastating death in 1997, global mourning engulfed every continent. Flower carpets blanketed Kensington Palace gates. Heartfelt letters arrived from Earth's furthest corners. Yet amid the overwhelming tributes and tears, one delicate question lingered within royal walls. What fate awaited her most treasured possessions? The solution emerged gradually, with extraordinary care. Numerous Diana garments were auctioned for charitable causes, generating millions for organizations she had passionately supported. However, her wedding gown, that sacred creation of silk and lace, received entirely different treatment. It was never considered for sale or casual display. To her sons, William and Harry, it transcended historical significance. It was their mother's captured essence. The gown received meticulous preservation treatment. Textile conservation experts were summoned to examine every pearl, every delicate lace thread, ensuring time could never steal its magnificence. It was sealed within a specialized container, cushioned in layers of acid-free tissue, and stored in a climate-controlled sanctuary. For years, it rested there, guarded with crown jewel vigilance, untouched by light, moisture, or dust. To the public, it became legendary. People discussed it as though it were a holy relic. Whenever Diana exhibitions were mentioned, whispers inevitably returned to the dress. Was it secure? Would it ever be displayed again? The surrounding mystery only amplified the gown's mystical power. For William and Harry, though, the dress held deeply personal significance. They were mere boys when grief stole their mother. William, 15, Harry, only 12. Loss had silenced her voice, her laughter, her embraces, but the gown remained, silent and steadfast, like a guardian of precious memory. They would occasionally request to see it, walking solemnly into the secure chamber where it resided. Staff described these moments reverently, with profound respect. William would stand motionlessly before the container for extended periods, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed upon the fabric's folds. Harry, more restless by nature, would circle it slowly, his expression intense, as if searching for the mother he could no longer hold. One aide once whispered, "It felt as if Diana's presence lingered in that dress. It carried her spirit." When Catherine entered William's life, the dress assumed new layers of meaning. She had never met Diana, yet Diana's influence permeated everything. The public constantly compared them, their elegance, their compassion, their radiant smiles. Catherine understood that the gown wasn't merely a wedding symbol, but a bridge connecting past and present. The first time she viewed it, she reportedly stood in reverent silence, tears welling in her eyes. She placed her palm gently against the protective glass, almost reaching toward Diana herself. "It's breathtaking," she whispered. "More than beautiful, it was sacred." To Catherine, the dress represented the woman who had raised the man she loved. It was the connection between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, transcending their temporal separation. Privately, she admitted sometimes feeling Diana's presence most powerfully near that gown. "It's as though she's watching over us," she once confided to a trusted friend. The dress also became Catherine's guide as she embraced her royal responsibilities. She grasped history's weight, the expectations placed upon her shoulders, and the world's eternal scrutiny. She often studied Diana's wedding photographs, observing how she balanced shyness with strength. For Catherine, the gown wasn't merely fabric. It was a masterclass in grace under pressure. Yet pain accompanied the beauty. The gown didn't only represent a fairy tale wedding, it also symbolized everything lost: the failed marriage, the heartbreak, and ultimately, Diana's tragic death. Each time William and Harry gazed upon it, they saw not just their mother's happiest day, but the sorrow that followed. Still, they couldn't release it. It was theirs to protect. When the brothers reached adulthood, the dress was formally entrusted to their care. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but they agreed it belonged under their guardianship. They would determine when and how the world might see it again. Camilla's haunting shadow. When discussing Diana's dress, one cannot avoid mentioning Camilla Parker Bowles. For many, these women remain forever intertwined, not by choice, but by history's cruel design. Diana was the young bride, the fairy tale princess. Camilla was the older love from Charles's past, the woman who never truly departed his heart. Camilla's path into the royal family proved treacherous. For years, she existed in shadows, whispered about in tabloids, and condemned in hushed conversations. To many, she embodied the villain in Diana's story, the other woman. Even after Diana's passing, forgiveness remained elusive. Within palace walls, that tension persisted. Staff addressed her respectfully, but without warmth. In private corners, servants would murmur, "She will never replace Diana." The comparison haunted Camilla everywhere, as though she inhabited a house built upon another woman's memory. When she finally married Charles in 2005, Camilla chose not to wear an elaborate white gown or sparkling tiara. She selected a modest dress, quiet, and understated. It was a choice that spoke volumes. She recognized she could never compete with Diana's image, so she didn't attempt to. Still, whispers persisted. Many wondered if Diana's ghost would eternally haunt her. Camilla herself wasn't blind to this reality. She often maintained rigid composure, but privately, she understood her place in the royal narrative would forever remain complicated. She was accepted, but rarely embraced, respected, but seldom adored. The people had admired Diana, loved her, mourned her, Camilla, by contrast, was merely tolerated. This tension intensified when William married Catherine. The young couple reminded the world of Diana and Charles in their early days, but with one crucial difference. Catherine was beloved. She was seen as graceful, kind, and devoted, much like Diana. Crowds cheered her, newspapers praised her, and her popularity soared. For Camilla, the comparisons must have cut deeply. Behind palace curtains, resentment occasionally surfaced. There were rumors of sharp glances, clipped words, and private confrontations. Camilla desired respect as Charles's wife, yet she was perpetually measured against the memory of the woman whose dress still rested like a crown in the royal vaults. One aide once described the atmosphere simply, "Diana cast a shadow, but a luminous one. Camilla walked within it, and Catherine inherited it." This delicate balance between old wounds and new duties created invisible tensions within the royal household. On the surface, there were smiles and courteous words, but underneath, strain simmered. Camilla represented Charles's past, Catherine represented William's future, and Diana's memory stood silently between them all. Every time Diana's name was mentioned, Camilla stiffened slightly. Every time an old Diana photograph appeared in newspapers, Camilla was reminded that she could never erase her predecessor. The past was too powerful, too beloved, yet Camilla possessed her own strength. She learned to survive in silence. She maintained dignity, performed her duties, and grew closer to Charles. But still, inside the palace, whispers continued. Could the Queen Consort ever stand equal in a world where Diana's memory reigned supreme? The wedding dress became part of that silent struggle. For William and Harry, it was sacred. For Catherine, it was a precious remembrance. But for Camilla, it was a reminder of the woman to whom she had been compared in every cruel headline. A gown that symbolized a fairy tale, while her own love story with Charles had been hidden in shadows for decades. Camilla had entered the royal family. She possessed a title, status, Charles's love. But what she could never claim was the crown of adoration that Diana still wore in people's hearts. That crown, like the dress, remained untouchable. The forbidden sanctuary. Deep within the palace lies a chamber few have ever entered. No tourists venture there, no photographs are permitted, and no curious gazes are allowed. It is a room secured under multiple locks, a space known among staff as the sanctuary. This is where Diana's wedding gown rested. The sanctuary lacks beauty. It is stark, cold, and silent. The walls are reinforced, the lighting minimal, and the atmosphere carefully controlled to protect fabrics from time's decay. Inside, shelves hold numerous boxes, each containing precious royal garments. But one container stands apart, larger, more secure, wrapped and sealed with extraordinary care. Within lies the ivory silk gown that once mesmerized the world. Only a select few are permitted entry. Conservation experts examine the dress periodically, ensuring no thread weakens, no pearl loosens, no lace fades. Each inspection feels ritualistic, performed in reverent silence with protective gloves. No one dares treat the gown as ordinary cloth. It is history incarnate, nearly sacred. One staff member once whispered, "It feels like standing in a cathedral when you're near it." For Catherine, the sanctuary became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Occasionally, she would request to see the dress. Not for exhibition, not for fashion, but for memory. She walked the narrow corridors, her footsteps echoing, until she reached the container. The first time, she stood motionless for an extended period, her breath catching in her throat. The gown seemed to glow even under the dim lighting, its folds arranged carefully as if waiting for Diana to return and wear it once more. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She thought of William as a boy, losing his mother, clinging to fragments of her that could never be sufficient. Now, here was the greatest fragment of all, her wedding dress, untouched by time's passage. Sometimes, Catherine would reach out and place her hand on the protective glass, not to touch the gown, but to feel closer to it. She whispered once, almost to herself. She must have been terrified, stepping out of that carriage. The attendants nearby remained silent. They understood. Another time she murmured softly, "It's not just a dress. It's her living presence." But one day, something unprecedented occurred. The palace was unusually quiet that afternoon. Camilla walked with slow, deliberate steps. Her heels clicked against the polished marble, each step sharp in the profound silence. Behind her, an aide carried a thin leather folder, his expression rigid and unreadable. At the security desk, the guard straightened quickly. The aide slid the document across. "Temporary access. Artifact inspection," he explained. The guard hesitated only briefly before pressing the buzzer. A lock within the wall released with a dull thud. The corridor beyond was narrow and gray. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed faintly. The air grew colder the deeper they walked, until it felt less like a palace and more like a tomb. At the passage's end, a reinforced door waited. "Shall I notify the conservators?" the aide asked quietly. Camilla shook her head. "No, that won't be necessary." The sanctuary door swung open. A draft of chilled air whispered past them, carrying the faint scent of preservation chemicals and aged fabric. The room itself was austere, its thick walls lined with shelves of labeled containers. No velvet, no ornaments, no grandeur, just order and silence. And there, at the center, sat the container. Larger than the rest, sealed with brass fastenings, its polished nameplate inscribed with simple words: "Diana, Princess of Wales. Wedding gown, 1981. Camilla stopped. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her reflection wavered in the protective glass, pale and ghost-like. The weight of history pressed down. Every thread in that container seemed to carry voices, headlines, comparisons she had endured for decades. "This won't take long," she said softly. Her gloved fingers opened the latches one by one. The clicks sounded too loud in the sanctuary's hush. She lifted the lid. Tissue gleamed white under the dim light. Carefully folded layers revealed the gown. Ivory silk that seemed to glow as though alive. Lace edges delicate as frost. Pearls stitched in tiny, perfect rows. She stared. How can fabric carry such weight? The thought pressed against her chest. The aide shifted uneasily. "Ma'am, perhaps we should wait." "No," she said. Her voice was steady. "We've waited long enough." From the shelf beside her, she lifted the conservation kit. Small brushes, cotton pads, a bone folder, and scissors with narrow blades that gleamed faintly in her hand. She weighed them a moment, then lowered them toward the fabric. The first cut was small, almost a whisper. A faint snip broke the silence. A pearl slipped free from its thread and rolled across the table, tapping once before resting against her glove. Camilla did not stop. Another cut. Another pearl. The sound was gentle, but relentless. Silk surrendering with each press of the blade. The gown that once commanded a cathedral was slowly unraveling into helpless fragments. "This dress," she murmured, "has ruled every conversation for 40 years." Her hand moved again, slicing through a puffed sleeve. "It will not rule me." A small alarm chirped. A temperature shift, nothing more, but the noise startled the aide. Camilla's jaw tightened. Her scissors pressed harder, cutting straight through the bodice seam. The silk tore with a sound too sharp for such delicate cloth. Piece by piece, the gown surrendered. The train, once 25 feet of majesty, became a scatter of strips on the floor. The puffed sleeves collapsed into shapeless heaps. The antique lace sagged in her hands. She paused, staring at the fragments. "You were just a dress," she whispered, "but they worshipped you like a saint." She reached into the lining and felt something small. A charm. She pulled it free. A tiny gold horseshoe glinted in her palm. The secret token for luck, hidden decades ago. She studied it for a moment, then set it down gently. "Even luck runs out," she said. She let the scissors rest on the table. For the first time, her hands trembled slightly. She pressed them down until they stilled. Then, with one last glance at the wreckage of silk and pearls, she turned for the door. The aide remained, staring at what was left. The dress was gone. Only fragments remained, pearls scattered like fallen tears, lace loosened like wilted flowers, ivory silk in strips that no longer held form. It was a wound made of fabric, glowing faintly under the sanctuary light. Catherine's devastating discovery that day. Morning began like any other within the palace. The rain had ceased, leaving the air cool and heavy. Catherine was in her private study, reviewing correspondence, when an aide entered. His face was ashen, his hands trembling. He bowed slightly, but his voice shook. He struggled to find the words. Finally, he whispered that something terrible had happened. Camilla had entered the sanctuary. Camilla had touched what should never be touched. The sacred dress of Diana had been cut apart. For a moment, Catherine didn't move. The words felt surreal. She stared at him, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then, without another thought, she pushed back her chair and rushed from the room. Her footsteps echoed down the long corridor. She moved faster, almost running. Staff turned their heads as she passed, their faces filled with alarm. But no one dared to stop her. The palace clock ticked overhead, marking each step she took toward the sanctuary. When she reached the secure wing, the guard at the desk looked startled. He tried to speak, but Catherine raised her hand and walked straight past him. The heavy door opened, and she stepped into the cold corridor. She pushed open the sanctuary door. Her eyes fell on the table, and her breath caught. The gown was destroyed. Not gone completely, but obliterated. The ivory silk was torn into ribbons. The long train, once folded neatly, had been cut apart like confetti. Pearls were scattered across the floor, rolling into corners like tiny fallen stars. The bodice lay in halves, its seams slashed open. Catherine gasped and stumbled forward. Her knees weakened as she reached the table, her hand flying to her mouth. The sight was overwhelming. The dress she had revered, the dress that belonged to William and Harry, the dress that had once belonged to Diana. It was ruined. She touched the fabric with trembling fingers. The silk was soft, but lifeless. She lifted a strip and held it to her chest, as if by holding it she could protect what remained. But nothing could undo what had been done. Her voice cracked as tears filled her eyes. This was all we had left of her. Her final gift, she cried. The words shattered inside the sanctuary, falling heavy into the silence. The aide who had followed her stood at the door, his face stricken. Another staff member appeared, but stopped when he saw Catherine's tears. The room felt frozen, as though time itself had paused. Catherine bent lower, her tears falling onto the scraps of silk. She picked up a pearl and turned it in her fingers. It glistened in the dim light, a small piece of beauty from what had once been whole. She closed her fist around it, her body shaking. The pain was deep, but beneath it something stronger began to rise. Her voice steadied as she looked at the aides. "This dress may be gone," she said, "but she is not. Diana will never be erased." She stood slowly, still holding a strip of silk in her hand. Her steps were unsteady at first, but her back was straight. She turned toward the door, her eyes burning with determination through her grief. As she walked out, the aides stayed behind. They looked at the torn fabric, the scattered pearls, the broken bodice. None spoke. They all knew they had witnessed something they would carry with them forever. Catherine confronts Camilla. After Catherine left the sanctuary, her cheeks were wet, her hands still shaking as she held the strip of silk and the tiny gold horseshoe. She walked quickly through the corridors, each step growing faster, stronger. Her grief was still fresh, but beneath it burned fury. She knew where Camilla would be. Through the tall doors of the drawing room, Catherine entered without waiting to be announced. Camilla was seated by the window, a cup of tea at her side, a newspaper folded on the table. She looked up calmly as Catherine stormed in. The air between them tightened. Catherine's eyes were red, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She stepped closer, her voice breaking. "How could you?" she cried. "It was hers, the last piece of her we had." Camilla set the cup down slowly. Her face remained composed, though her eyes flickered. She answered in a voice low and steady. "It was a dress," she said. "Nothing more. Cloth and thread." Catherine's hands clenched at her sides. She shook her head, tears welling again. "No, it was her memory. It was her presence for William, for Harry, for our children. You destroyed it because you could not bear her shadow." Camilla's mouth tightened. "That shadow has inhabited this palace longer than I have. I will not spend the rest of my life bowing to a ghost." The words struck Catherine like a physical blow. Her breath caught, but she stepped closer, her voice rising. "You cannot erase her. Cutting that gown will not cut her out of our lives. She will always be here, loved, remembered, honored, and you will never take that away." Camilla stood now, her expression hardening. The quiet composure was gone, replaced with steel. "You think you understand? You live in her glow, welcomed by it. I have lived under its shadow for decades. Every smile I give is compared to hers. Every step I take is measured against her. The dress was a shrine, and shrines can trap the living." Catherine's tears spilled again, but her voice was steady. It was not a shrine. It was a gift for her sons, a piece of their mother kept safe. You took it from them. You broke it, not to free yourself, but to feed your envy. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking of a clock. Camilla's eyes narrowed, but she did not answer. Catherine lifted the strip of silk she had carried from the sanctuary and placed it on the table between them. The torn fabric spread across the polished wood like a wound. "This is what you've left us," Catherine said. Her voice shook with both grief and fury. "Scraps, ribbons, but do not mistake this for victory. Diana is still here, in William, in Harry, in her grandchildren, in the people who will never forget her." Her hand rested on the torn fabric one last time before she turned to leave. She did not bow. She did not look back. Her steps were sharp, her head held high. Camilla stood alone in the room, staring at the strip of silk on the table. The clock ticked on. Outside, the rain began to fall again, steady and cold against the palace windows. Catherine walked the corridors quickly, her tears drying into resolve. She knew William must be told. She knew the world might never know. William's silent rage. Catherine returned to their private rooms with a pale face and heavy steps. William saw her at once and knew something had happened. She placed 3 small pearls in his hand. He understood, without words. Together they went to the sanctuary. The guards opened the way without question. The air in the corridor was cold and humming. When the door swung open, William saw the truth for himself. The dress was destroyed. The container was open. The silk lay in strips. Pearls were scattered across the table and floor. The bodice was cut in 2. The long train, once majestic, was reduced to ribbons. William stood very still. His jaw tightened, and the muscles in his face grew hard. He did not shout. He did not cry. He simply looked at what remained of his mother's gown. He stepped forward and touched one of the torn edges with his fingertips. It felt soft, but lifeless. He let the fabric fall and picked up a pearl. He held it in his palm for a long moment before setting it down again with the others. Catherine stayed near him, her hand resting lightly at his side. She watched his back rise and fall as he breathed, slow and steady. His silence was heavy, stronger than any words. The aides lingered in the doorway, uneasy and pale. William gave no instructions aloud, but his presence was command enough. They stood quietly, waiting. He circled the table once, examining every piece. He paused at the small gold horseshoe left in the corner. He picked it up, studied it, then placed it carefully in Catherine's hand. His movements were controlled, deliberate. He leaned on the table, close to the broken bodice. His eyes glistened, but no tears fell. For a moment, he closed them, and memories rushed in. The cathedral, the bells, the long white train flowing behind his mother as the world watched. Then he opened his eyes and faced the ruins before him. He gathered 3 pearls. One he slipped into his pocket. One he gave to Catherine to hold. The last he placed on the windowsill inside the sanctuary, leaving it as a silent sentinel over what was lost. Slowly, he gave his orders. Every piece of silk, every pearl, every thread was to be collected with care. Nothing was to be repaired or changed. Everything would be preserved exactly as it was now. The container would be sealed and locked again. Catherine stood beside him, still holding the tiny horseshoe. She looked at him and saw the fire in his eyes. His anger was not loud, not wild. It was cold, sharp, and full of control. It was the kind of anger that did not vanish, but waited, deep and steady. At last, he took Catherine's hand and led her out of the sanctuary. He paused at the door and looked back one final time. His face remained strong, but his eyes carried the weight of grief and fury. But for William, everything had changed. Harry's reaction. News of the ruined gown reached Harry. The message was delivered quietly, in careful words, but the meaning struck him like lightning. Diana's wedding dress, the sacred gown he and William had protected for so long, was destroyed. For a long time, Harry did not speak. He sat still, staring at the floor. His chest rose and fell, but no sound came out. Then his hand clenched into a fist. His face was pale, his jaw tight. Memories crashed over him. He remembered being 12 years old, walking behind his mother's coffin, holding back tears as the world watched. He remembered the comfort of knowing that the dress, at least, was safe, carefully stored, preserved, untouched. It had been a piece of her, a part of her story, something he and William shared. Now, even that was gone. When the aide finished explaining, Harry finally lifted his head. His voice was low, hoarse with grief. He asked how it had happened. The answer was given in careful tones. The sanctuary, the scissors, the pearls scattered, Catherine's tears, and behind it all, Camilla. Later, when he spoke to William, his voice broke. He asked what Catherine had seen, how she had wept, how she had carried the pieces in her hands. He listened in silence, and when William finished, there was nothing but heavy breathing on the other end. Two brothers, wounded again by the same shadow. For Harry, the loss was more than anger. It was betrayal. He had trusted the palace to guard what little of Diana remained. He had believed the sanctuary was safe. Now he felt the same old ache, the ache of losing her again and again. At night, Harry sat alone. He held a framed photo of Diana, taken on her wedding day. He studied her smile, her eyes, the way she glowed in the gown that now lay in tatters. He whispered that he was sorry. Sorry that he could not protect it. Sorry that he had not been there. A destroyed symbol. The wedding dress had once been more than fabric. It was a symbol carried across the world. On the day Diana wore it, millions had believed they were watching the beginning of a true fairy tale. For years, it remained a picture of innocence, youth, and hope. Now, reduced to scraps of silk and loose pearls, the gown's destruction carried a meaning deeper than cloth. It was not only the ruin of a garment, but the breaking of an idea. The pifu dress had stood for memory, for love, and for the part of Diana that could never be taken away. To William and Harry, it had been the closest thing to her presence. They had touched it, remembered her through it, and trusted that it would remain safe. It had survived decades, carefully guarded, so that her legacy would always have a shape people could see. Its loss was not just personal, it was historical. Inside, the palace. Silence grew heavier with each passing day. The fragments of the gown were preserved, but they could not be restored. What had been one of the most famous dresses in the world was now only pieces. The knowledge of this filled every corner with unease. The sanctuary was locked, but the sense of damage could not be hidden. The destruction also changed how people thought of Diana's story. Her life had been full of light and tragedy, her memory bright and untouchable. The dress had been proof of that, an object that reminded people of her beauty and her innocence. Now that proof had been undone. It felt as though her memory itself had been attacked. In the quiet of the palace, some feared that the damage was more than physical. The gown had been a point of unity, something that belonged to both William and Harry, something they could share even in difficult times. Now it was gone, and the gap between them seemed wider. The pieces would remain, but the power of the whole was lost. The symbolism reached further still. The public might never know, but those within the palace did. And for them, it felt like an erasure. It was as though a part of Diana had been cut away, deliberately or not, leaving only silence where once there had been presence. The vow to preserve Diana's legacy. The palace grew quiet after the storm. The dress was gone, destroyed forever. But the loss did not end with silk and pearls. It weighed on Catherine and William like a shadow, heavy and unshakable. Late one night, Catherine and William sat together in their private room. On the table between them lay the small gold horseshoe Catherine had taken from the ruined gown. It shone faintly in the lamplight. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence was long, filled with memories and pain. Finally, William placed his hand over Catherine's. His jaw was still tight, his face still pale from anger. But his eyes were steady. He told her they could not change what had been done. They could not bring back the dress, but they could make sure Diana's spirit was never erased. Catherine nodded. She had already thought the same. That night, together, they made a vow. They would keep Diana's legacy alive. Not through relics locked in vaults, not through silk or lace, but through living acts of kindness, memory, and love. From that moment, Catherine began to work with new purpose. Every charity event she attended, every cause she supported, carried Diana's spirit in it. She visited hospitals and children's homes, kneeling to speak with the young and the vulnerable. She organized events for mothers and families, knowing how Diana had once been called the people's princess for that same compassion. Catherine made sure her presence echoed the warmth Diana had given. William joined her. Together, they traveled to support mental health organizations, a cause Diana had championed in her time. They opened centers for young people, spoke about the importance of care and understanding, and met families who had suffered in silence. William spoke often about his mother, telling people that her work inspired him to continue. In private, Catherine made sure their children would not forget the grandmother they had never met. At bedtime, she showed George, Charlotte, and Louis photographs of Diana, her smile, her kindness, her joy. She told them stories about the way she helped others, the way she stood beside people who were hurting, the way she showed love even in difficult times. She explained that Diana had been more than a princess. She had been a mother, a friend, and a woman of courage. The children listened with wide eyes, asking questions, wanting to know more. Catherine answered every one, because she knew the stories mattered more now than ever. On special days, Catherine and William brought the children to places where Diana had once worked. They visited hospitals where she had comforted patients. They walked through gardens dedicated in her memory. They stood before statues built in her honor, explaining gently who she was and why people still loved her so deeply. In these ways, Diana remained alive in their family, not through the gown that had been torn, but through living memory passed from parent to child. Catherine also began to shape her public work with Diana in mind. She focused on children's welfare, on mental health, on families in need. The same causes Diana had carried close to her heart. She met with charities quietly, often without cameras, just as Diana had once done. She listened, she comforted, she gave time and warmth. In every gesture, there was a thread of Diana woven through her actions. William supported her fully. Together, they stood as a team, not just for the crown, but for the promise they had made in private. Every ribbon cut, every speech given, every hand held was done with their vow in mind. Diana's legacy would not fade. Behind palace walls, their vow also shaped their family life. They raised their children not only as royals, but as children who understood empathy, kindness, and duty. Catherine reminded them often that their grandmother had believed in love and compassion above all things. William added stories of her laughter, her playfulness, her warmth. Through both of them, Diana became real to George, Charlotte, and Louis. More than a photograph, more than a name, more than a story whispered by others. The gold horseshoe Catherine had taken from the wreckage became a symbol of their vow. She kept it safe in a small box on her desk. Sometimes, when days were hard, she opened the box, held the charm, and remembered. The gown was gone, but the spirit of Diana was not. It was alive in their work, their family, their children. The world outside the palace noticed too. People began to speak of Catherine and William as carrying forward Diana's light. Crowds cheered when they visited, not only for who they were, but for the memory they kept alive. Newspapers drew comparisons, writing that Diana's compassion lived on in her son and his wife. For Catherine, this was not about praise. It was about duty and love. She knew what had been lost, but she also knew what remained. Each smile she gave, each act of kindness she showed was part of a promise she and William had made together. To keep Diana alive in more than memory, to keep her present in action, to ensure her name would never fade into silence. Years would pass, and the children would grow. They would hear many stories of Diana, some from the world, some from strangers, but the most important stories would come from their parents. Catherine and William would make sure of that. The dress may have been destroyed, but Diana's true legacy, her love, her compassion, her dedication to others, would live on through her son, her daughter-in-law, and her grandchildren. In the end, no scissors could cut that away. No jealousy could destroy it. No shadow could eclipse the light she had left behind. And in the quiet moments, when Catherine held that tiny golden horseshoe, she could almost feel Diana's presence. Not in silk or lace, but in the love that surrounded her family, the causes they championed, and the hope they carried forward into the future. The sacred dress was gone, but the sacred memory would endure forever.